In this video, we are going to build a browser client to communicate with the Feathers backend that we built in the previous videos. So if you go into the public folder and click on app.js, you can see the code that we wrote before to do some basic authentication. One thing we're going to do is create a variable that's going to hold all of the HTML for our login page. So let's do that first. So we need a variable called login HTML, and this is just going to be a template string. Inside of here, we're going to have a main element. And this is going to have a class of login and container. And then inside of the main element, we're going to have a row that's going to just have the header for the page. So we'll have a div class equals row. And inside of this div, we will have a column. So we'll have a div with class column 12, column 6 tablet, push 3 tablet, text center, and heading. So these are just a few classes that are provided for us in the CSS that we already brought in. That's going to give us some responsive design. So the login form will look good both on mobile and on desktop. Inside of this header, we're just going to have an h1, and this is going to have a class of font 100. And inside of this h1, we will say login or sign up. Awesome. So this is super basic, but let's just make sure that it works. So now we're going to create a function that takes this HTML and puts it onto the page. So if you look at our index.html, it has this div with ID app. We're essentially just going to write a function that takes this HTML here and puts it into that section. So I'll create a function called showLogin. This will be just a simple function that does document.get element by ID app. And we're going to set its inner HTML to be the login HTML. So we're essentially just going to overwrite it to be this HTML that we created up above. What we'll do is when the page loads, we'll just call showLogin. And let's see what happens. So if we go back to the browser, refresh the page, we get a header, login or sign up. So that's a good sign. Let's keep on coding. All right, so now below the header, which is right here, we're going to add the actual form where the user can either sign in or log up. So we're going to create a div with a class of row. And inside of this div, we're going to have another div. And this div will have some classes. So we're going to add the classes column 12, column 6 tablet, push 3 tablet, column 4 desktop, and push for desktop. Now again, these are just some responsive classes that'll make this form look good both on mobile and desktop. Now inside of this div, we're going to have our login form. Like that. This form will have a class of form. And inside of the form, we'll create all of our fields. So we'll add a field set. Inside of this field set, we'll have the input for the email. So we'll have an input, class equals block, type equals email, name equals email, and then placeholder equals email. Let's save that, go back to the browser, refresh, and we get an email input. Awesome. All right, on to the next input. We're going to create an input for the password. So I'm just going to copy this one. We'll paste it right below. We'll change the type to password. We'll change the name to password. And we'll change the placeholder to password. Save it, back to the browser, refresh. We have a password input. Wonderful. Now below the form, we're going to add 2 buttons, one for login and one for sign up and login. So we'll create a button. And in here, we'll have a type of button. We'll have an ID of login. We'll have a class of button, button-primary, block, and sign up. And inside of the button, we will say log in. Let's save it, back to the browser, refresh. We have a wonderful login button. Awesome. Let's keep on coding. So below that button, we need another one. And I'm actually just going to copy and paste this one. We'll need to change the ID to be sign up. And then we'll change the text inside of the button to say sign up and log in. Refresh the page. Awesome, we have a button. And the last thing we'll do is add a button to log in with GitHub. So our system will either allow the user to sign up with email and password, or they can just sign up with GitHub. And below this button, we will add a button for logging in with GitHub. Now, this is actually just going to be an anchor tag because it's going to link out to our OAuth page, which redirects to GitHub. So this anchor tag will have a class of button primary, and block. And the href will be to our GitHub OAuth page. So this is going to be /OAuth/GitHub. And then inside of the tag, we will have login with GitHub. Save that, refresh the page. Awesome. So we have our two inputs, we have our buttons that we can click. And if we click this button, it actually should redirect us to GitHub and then back to the page. I'll click it. We got redirected and immediately redirected back. Awesome. All right, we have a login form. So now what we're going to do is we're going to allow the user to enter in an email and password and then click the sign up and login button. That will actually call our backend, sign up the user, and then log them into the system. So let's code that. Now, in our JavaScript, I am first going to create a helper function. So I'm going to create a function called add event listener, and essentially we'll be able to reuse this function to add a click listener to both the login and the sign up button. So we're going to create this thing called add event listener. It's going to take in the selector, the event, and the handler. We will then just call the native document.add event listener. We'll pass in the event that we're looking for. We'll have an event handler. And inside of this handler, we want to see if it is the closest to the given selector. So we will say if event.target.closest to the selector. We will then call that handler with the event. Awesome. So this is just a helper function, and now we're going to actually use this to tap into when the user clicks that sign up button. So we'll call add event listener. We'll pass in the sign up ID. So this is the selector that will select that button. We'll then say that we're listening for the click event, and then we'll pass in our handler. Now inside of here, we need to get what the user actually entered into the form. So I'll create a variable called credentials. And that's going to be equal to get credentials. And now I need a function called get credentials, which will actually get the credentials from the form. So we're going to create that right here. And this is going to be a function. And we're going to create a user object, and that user object is going to have an email. The email will grab from the form, so we'll say document.querySelector. We're going to grab the element with the name attribute, where the name attribute is equal to email, like so. And we're going to grab that current value, the value, that. And then we're going to do the same thing for password. But we need to change our selector because we want the element where the name is password. Awesome. Now we have the user object, so we're just going to return the user, like so. And down here in our function, that user would have been returned and put into the credentials variable. So for now, let's just log the credentials to make sure that all of this is working. Credentials. Cool. So if we go to the browser, we'll do a refresh. We'll try test@test.com. Password. We'll open the DevTools, and then we'll click sign up. And we do get an object with an email and a password. So good so far. So now that we have this object, we want to send that to the backend so we can actually create that user on the backend. All right, so now we don't need to log the credentials, but we'll actually call a Feather service to create this user. So I'll do await client.service users.create and I'll pass in those credentials. So this is actually going to reach out to the backend users service, and it will create a user with the credentials that we pass in. After we've done that, we can just immediately log in the user. So I'll say await login with the credentials. And we have that login function that we created before, but now we need to update that login function to actually use these credentials. So if we go back up to our login function, we'll take in the credentials as a parameter. And now instead of using these hard-coded credentials, we'll pass in the credentials that the user entered. And so now that will attempt to log in the user using those credentials that they just signed up with. Now, one thing that we'll do is we'll do some checking. So right now we have when the page loads, we just immediately show the login page. What I'm going to do is in our login function, if there was an error, then we will display the login page. So let's do this. In our try catch, we're going to say, if there are no credentials, then attempt to re-authenticate the user. Else, this is where we will do the login. So if there are no credentials potentially when the page loads, we're going to try to re-authenticate them using the existing credentials. But if we passed in the credentials, we're going to try and log in with the user there. Now, if all of this was successful, we should show the chat messages, right? So if they are successfully logged in, we need to show the chat messages. But if there was an error, we should show the login page. And one thing we'll do is we'll actually pass in the error that occurred, and we can display that error on the login form itself. So now we should update our show login function to take in the error. And if there is an error, we're going to display it on the login form. Okay, so show login will take in the error. And now this is where we can check to see if the error, if there was an error, and we'll display it on the page. So we'll say if document.querySelectorAll query selector all for the element with ID login dot length. So if we're showing the login page and there is an error, then we're going to grab the heading and set the error in the heading. So we'll say document.querySelector the element with the class heading, and we're going to insert some adjacent HTML. And it'll be right before the end. And we're just going to have a p tag that has the error message inside of it. So we'll say p tag, there was an error. And right there, we'll just throw error.message. So if there was an error logging in, we're going to show that message on the login form. Otherwise, we just show the login form. Cool. So when the page loads, if there is no error, we should just see the login form. And this essentially will attempt to authenticate them. And if there was an error, show the error. Okay, so if the login is successful, we actually do just want to at least log something to the console so that we know it was successful, and then we'll write the code to show the chat window. I'm going to remove these return statements so that way that the function doesn't exit early. Essentially, it will try to re-authenticate the user or log them in if we just attempted to sign up and log in. And then here, we're just going to log sign up /login success, go to chat window, ... And if this works, we should see this log to the console. So I'll refresh. We'll try to sign up with test@test.com, password 123. We'll click sign up and login, and we see the console log sign up /login success, go to the chat window. So now we'll actually code the chat window, which is where we'll display all the messages, and users will be able to send messages. So in here, just like we have this login HTML variable, we're going to create another variable called chat HTML. So here we'll create a variable called chat HTML. This will be a template string. Inside of that, we need a main element. This will have a class of flex and flex column. Inside of the main, we'll have a header. This will have a class of title bar, flex row, and flex center. Inside of the header, we'll have a div. This div will have a class of title wrapper, block, center element. And inside of here, we'll have our feathers logo. So I'll do an image with class of logo. The source is going to be http://feathers.js.com/image/feathers-wide.png. We'll have some alt text that just says feathers logo. And below this image, we'll have a span with class title. And inside of that, we'll just say chat. Awesome. So we have some more chat HTML that we're going to need, but let's just get this working to see if it actually shows up on the page. So I'm going to create a function similar to show login, but this is going to be show chat. So I'll say show chat. This will be a function that just says document.getElementById app, and it sets its inner HTML to be the chat HTML. Cool. Simple enough. And then now I just need to call this show chat function. So in our login function, if we had a successful reauthentication or authentication, we should show the chat window. And so essentially that will hide the login form and show the chat window. So let's see what happens. I'll save this, I'll refresh the page, and we see the chat window. So we can see the header bar up top. And now we need to actually write the rest of the chat HTML. So back down here to chat HTML. Below the header, we'll have a div. This div will have a class of flex, flex row, flex one, and clear. Inside of this div, we'll have an aside. This is where we're going to show all of the chat users that are in our system. This aside will have a class of sidebar, column, column 3, flex, flex column, and flex space between. This sidebar will have a header of its own, so we'll have a header. This will have a class of flex, flex row, flex center. Inside of the header, we'll have an h4. This will have a class of font 300, text center. And inside of here, we'll have a span with a class of font 600, online count. And there, this will default to 0, and we'll say users. So eventually we'll update this with the number of logged in users. Great. Below the header, we're going to add the list of users. So we'll have an unordered list. We'll give this a class of flex, flex column, flex one, and list unstyled user list. So later on, we'll use this user list selector to put all of our users into this list. And lastly, we'll add a footer. Footer. This footer will have a class of a flex, flex row, and flex center. And inside of the footer, we'll just have a link to sign out. So we're going to have an anchor tag. It will link to nowhere for now, just the hash. And it will have an ID of logout and a class of button-primary. And we'll say sign out. Let's try it out. Looks like we're being logged out. I have a feeling, yes. So this is some leftover code from earlier when we were demonstrating logout, but let's actually just remove this logout command. And so we should be able to, yeah, and now we actually need to log in because this button only signs up and logs in. So, I hate to have to do this, but just as an example, I'm going to comment out the create and we're going to attempt to log in with that sign up and login button. So test@test.com, 1, 2, 3, sign up and log in, and there we go. So we can see on the left-hand side, this is what we were just coding. We see that there were zero active users, and we have this sign out button. While we're here, let's get this sign out button working, and then we'll get the login button working as well. So back to the code. We're now going to implement sign out. So just below the sign up event listener, we're going to add an event listener for the element with ID logout. We're listening for the click event. And then we'll have our handler. And here we can say await client.logout. And then we will change from the chat page to the login page. So I'm just going to say document.get element by ID app.inner HTML. We're going to set that to the login HTML. So when we click the log out button, it should just show us the sign in page. We'll do a refresh, click the sign out button. Didn't work. Let's double check that our button does actually have the logout ID. We spelled it wrong, so we have 2 T's. Let's fix that. Save it, refresh the page, click the sign out button, and we have now logged out. Awesome. Let's get this login button working so both of these buttons work and we can log in with an existing user. So while we're thinking about it, we'll uncomment that create code that we had to comment out before, and now we'll add a listener for the login button. And it's very similar, so I'm just going to say add event listener for the element with ID login. We're listening for the click event. We have an async function. We're going to reuse that get credentials method that we called before, or that we created before, get credentials. And then we'll call our login function. So we'll say await login, and we'll pass in the user. So now the login button should allow us to log in with an existing user. So let's try that. We'll refresh the page. We'll try to log in with test@test.com, password, and then click login. Successful login, we get redirected to the chat page. Awesome. So now that we have those buttons working, let's continue working on the chat. So below the aside, we're now going to create a section that will show all of the messages, and we'll also have a form where the user can enter in their message. So here we'll have a div. This will have a class of flex column, and column 9. Inside of here, we'll have a main element. The main will have a class of chat, flex column, flex1, and clear. And essentially, we're going to fill this element with all of the chat messages, so that can remain like that. And below the chat window, we're going to have a form where the user can enter in a message. So here, we'll have a form. So we'll have class of flex row, flex space between, and it will have an ID of send message. And then we'll have an input. This will have a type of text, name of text, class of flex1, and below the input we'll have a button. So inside the button we'll say send, and this button will have a class of button-primary. So let's save that. If we go back to our app and refresh, we should see, awesome. So now we have a nice little chat window, and we have this input here where we can actually enter in our chat messages. Wonderful. So now that we have this working page with the area to list the users, the area to list the messages, let's actually write the code which will get the users from the backend and get the messages from the backend and fill them into these areas. So we're going to do that in our show chat function here. So we first set the HTML to be the chat HTML, and then we're going to reach out to the backend to grab all of the messages that exist on the backend. So we'll say const messages equals await client.service, We'll pass in the name of the service, which is messages. We'll say find. And we're going to pass in a query here. And we're going to say we want to sort by created at in reverse. So this is going to look at the created at field of every message, and it's going to give us those messages in reverse so that we see the newest messages at the bottom of the page. We're also going to limit to 25 messages. And so both of these things, sort and limit, these are just built into Feather's services. So by default, we automatically get access to changing the sort values, limiting how much we get back. And this is all communicating with that Feather's backend. This is complaining about client. Because this is not an async function. So we need to make this an async function. Great. And let's call these messages. So now that we have the messages, we want to add them to the page. So basically, we are going to iterate over the data. So we'll say messages.data.reverse for each. And we'll create a function called add message, which will add those messages to the page. We'll create that in just a second. We also want to get all of the users from the backend. So let's do this. We'll say users equals await client.service with users. And for this, we won't pass in any query. We'll just say find all of the users. And then we'll do a very similar thing. We'll say users.data.forEach add user. So now we need to implement these two functions, add message and add user. Add message is going to take a message and add it to the page. So we'll write that function now. And we'll write that function right here. So we'll say add message is a function that takes in a message and then adds it to the page. So the first thing we'll do is get the user out of the message, so that way we can display the user icon next to the message. So we'll say user, and we're doing some destructuring here from the message because the message should have a user object, but if it doesn't, we're going to default to an empty object. Then we need to get the chat element on the page. So we'll say chat equals document.query selector, and we'll pass in .chat. Then we're going to take the text of the message and do some sanitizing. So if any of the users were to send HTML or script tags or different things like that, if we didn't sanitize it, our client would actually run it. So we're going to do some replacing. So we'll say text equals message.text. So we're going to call .replace. And first thing we'll look for is any ampersands. So we want to replace any ampersands, that we find with the HTML encoded version, so it won't actually render on the page. So we'll say amp like that. We also want to replace all less than signs. So we'll have a regular expression that searches for less than and then replaces it with the HTML encoding. And then we'll do a very similar thing with the greater than symbols. Like that. Now, first we'll make sure that the chat element exists on the page. And then if it does, we're going to add this message to the page. So we'll say chat.innerHTML plus equals, and we're essentially just going to create a chat element that we're going to append to the list of all the chat messages. So we're going to have a div. This will have a class of message, flex, and flex row. Inside of the div, we'll show the user's avatar. So we're going to have an image with a source. The source will be user.avatar. And the alt text will be the user's email. And this will have a class of avatar. Below the user's image, we will have the actual message contents. So we'll have a div. This will have a class of message wrapper. Inside of this div, we'll have a header. So we'll have a p tag with the class of message header. Inside of that p tag, we'll have a span that's going to show the user's name. So we'll have a span with class of username and font 600. And we will show the user's email. Below that, we'll have the actual created at time. So we're going to have a span. So we'll have a class of sent date, font 300. And inside of here, we're going to use the moment library to format the date. So we've already brought the moment library into our index.html. So we'll use that here. We'll just say moment, and we'll pass in message.created at. And then we're going to format this with a simple format string, format. And we'll pass in the month, the day, hours, minutes, and seconds. Cool. So that should format the date. And lastly, we want to show the text of the message itself. So we'll add another p tag right here. This will have the text that we sanitized above. And this will have class of message content and a font weight of 300. Awesome. And then one thing we'll do is every time we add a chat message, we always want to scroll to the top so that if lots of messages are coming in, the page automatically scrolls. So we'll say chat.scrollTop equals chat.scrollHeight minus chat.clientHeight. So this should always just scroll to show the latest message. Awesome. Now the other function that we needed to implement was where were we? The add user function. So when the page loads, we're going to show all the users in our system on the left-hand side. So we also need this add user function. This is going to take in the user. And the first thing we'll do is grab that user list element on the page. So we'll say user list equals document.query selector for the element that has the class user list. And then we'll make sure that the user list actually exists. And if it does, we will add the user to the list. So we'll say user list.innerHTML plus equals. We'll do a template string. And this will just be a list item. The list item will have no classes. Inside of it, we'll have an anchor tag. The anchor tag will have a class of block and relative. And it will have an href that goes nowhere. And then inside of the anchor tag, we'll show the user's image. User.avatar. And this will have a class of avatar. And then below the image, we'll show the user's name. So this will have a span. We'll give this a class of absolute and username. And inside of the span, we'll show the user's email. There we go. And after appending this user to the list, we will then update the active user count. So if you remember, right now it just defaults to 0. So what we'll do is we'll select it. So we'll say user count equals document.query selector all. We're going to grab that element with the ID, with the class user list, and grab the length of all of the elements. And that essentially will give us the count of all the users. And then we'll update the user count. So we'll say document.query selector for the online count. And we're going to set its inner HTML. Oops. Online count. We're going to set the inner HTML to be the user count. Let's see what happens. And before we see what happens, I keep on typing like a double T. Did I do that? I didn't. Okay. So if we refresh the page, we see a list of all the users in our system. We see that there are 4 active users. And if there were any messages, they would have been shown here. But right now, there are no messages. So the last thing we need to do is to get this form working. Essentially, when we type in here and click send, that will send the message to the server, and it should appear here. So down here where we have all of our event listeners, we're also going to add an event listener for that send message button. So I'll say add event listener. We'll pass in the ID send-message. We're going to listen for the submit handler, and then we'll have an async function, which gives us access to the event, so that way we can prevent the default action when the form submits. We're going to grab the input, which is where the user typed their message. So we'll say document.query selector, and we'll grab the element where the name is text. So that should get what the user typed in the message box. We'll prevent the default action so the page doesn't refresh. And then we'll call the Feather service to create that message on the back end. So we'll say await client.service messages.create, and then we'll pass in the message that we want to create. In this case, the text is going to have input.value. So this is whatever the user entered into the form. And then we will clear the form after it was submitted. Awesome. So just like that, if I refresh the page, let's try sending a message, hello world. And if we click on the network tab and we click WebSockets, we can actually see any WebSocket messages that are occurring. We can see there was the message to log in. There was the list of all messages, which is empty. There's the list of all the users. And now if I click send, we see that it sent a create message over WebSockets to create that hello world text. And then we actually got back this message created event. But right now, we don't see anything, right? Yeah, we don't see anything on the page. But if I refresh the page, we do see that message. Now, that's very cumbersome. You don't want your users to have to refresh the page every time a new message gets created. So what we'll do is we'll listen for when any new message is created and automatically relist or re-add that message to the page. So let's do that. Right below this event listener, and just real quick typo, I meant to say input.value equals the empty string. So that way it actually clears the message box. Just to see that working, we'll say hello world again. Send. Oh, I didn't refresh. One more refresh. Hello world again. We'll click send, and the input clears. If I hard refresh the page, we see that message. But again, we don't want to keep refreshing the page. So to add messages to the page when they get created, it's actually extremely simple. So we'll say client.service messages.on. We'll say we're listening for the created event. So anytime a message is created, I want you to call that add message function, which we created before. So that function already exists. And the cool thing about this is not just when a message is created locally. This is when any message is created across our entire system. So you could have 10 users using the app, and if any one of them creates a message, this function is going to get called in the browser for every user. So now that we have that, let's refresh the page and try it out. So does this work? And it does. It pops up automatically. But the cool thing about that is we can actually show this in multiple windows. So if I have two windows open, both of them are on the chat page, and I say, can you see this over here? And I submit it, it pops up on both pages. So any users that are logged in, they would instantly see new messages that get added to the system. So that's great. One other thing we'll do is we'll listen for when new users get added to the system as well. And that is actually very similar. So we'll just say we're listening for the users service. And when a user is created, we want to call that add user function, which we created before. And so now if a user signs up, they'll automatically pop up into this list the moment that they sign up. So let's demonstrate that. I'm going to open an incognito window, so I shouldn't be logged in. And if we go to localhost 3030, we see that I can sign up. So I'm going to sign up as another user. Let's sign up as bob@ross.com, set a password, sign up and log in. And actually, I didn't refresh the page on the left-hand side. But we do see that the latest user is here. And if I say hello from Bob, click send, the message pops up. But let's actually see that happen. So I'm going to refresh this page, open a new incognito window, go to localhost 3030, and we're going to sign up another user. So let's say David@feathers.com. type in a password, sign up and log in. And we can see the moment that user signed up, it instantly popped up in the list of users as well. So we're listening to all sorts of real-time events. When new messages get created, when new users get created, it is fantastic. So one more thing I want to show, because I didn't demonstrate it, is logging in with GitHub. So on the left-hand side here, I'm going to sign out. I'm going to click login with GitHub, and this will be the cj@null.computer. That's me. That's going to be that user. So I'll click login. We can see that the login worked. And if I say hello world, we can actually see that that message is coming from me and the logged in user from GitHub. So that's it for the Feathers Chat client. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any more questions about Feathers, on the Feathers.js website, there is a help section where you can access all of the API documentation, the frequently asked questions. You can read through blog posts. There's also a Slack group that you can join if you need help with Feathers. And so I highly recommend that you check out all of these help resources. Thanks for watching.